Today at the Intelligence Forum's Who Are You podcast, we're incredibly privileged to have Dr. Thomas Smith, an associate professor in environmental geography at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much, Tom, for agreeing to do this interview today.
Yeah, good afternoon, Harry. Good to be here.
So the first question I'd like to put to you is, would you share your professional journey to where you are today?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to understand where and when it began exactly, but it feels to me like it began with geography at school. Geography was one of my favorite subjects, and if I look back to that time, I don't remember a great deal, but I do remember all of the field trips. And field trips were very important to me. I think they grounded me in the outdoors, and I loved looking at the world, and especially looking at things that weren't necessarily obvious to the untrained eye. And some of those early field trips are quite formative for me. And I chose to study geography at university. And again, that's when things get a little bit more complicated. I remember traveling to Tunisia, and that was a very important experience for my undergraduate education. I was looking at the reflectivity of sand. So it sounds a little bit strange, but it introduced me to spectroscopy as a methodology. So looking at the world in different wavelengths of light, and that can tell you things about the properties of surfaces, and it can also tell you things about the properties of the atmosphere as well. And so I chose to do a master's degree at King's College London. This was in environmental monitoring, modelling, and management. And this exposed me further to the possibilities of what you could do with this technique. I spent a lot of time on the roof of the Strand building here in London, looking at different urban surfaces, looking at their thermal properties using a spectrometer. And what you can do with that, you can essentially use this technique for mapping all of the different urban surfaces in London, and that can tell you things about how they heat up and cool down, and how that contributes to the urban heat island effect and things like that. And it was through that master's degree that I learned how to use a particular piece of equipment that would become very important for my career. I ended up starting a PhD to look at air pollution in London. Now, air pollution is a very important core part of what I do. But initially, I was supposed to focus on what comes out of cars, I guess, and buildings, and look at how it changes between the surface of the road and up at roof level. And I found that quite interesting, but really, I was still stuck in London, and I had an opportunity to go to Canada with my PhD supervisor, who was a fire scientist at the time, and that completely changed what I wanted to do. I remember driving down some highway from Edmonton up into Banff National Park, and we went round the corner, and suddenly in front of me, I saw this huge, massive fire. The flames were as tall as the Shard. The smoke plume looked like a mushroom cloud, looked like a huge bomb had gone off, and I thought, wow, this is really something. And that spectrometer I brought with me because I could look at the sun, and the sun's light coming through the smoke. I could detect all of the different gases in the smoke, and that was pretty neat. And I said to my supervisor, I said, I don't want to do this stuff in London anymore. I want to study wildfire smoke. So it all began in Canada, but I could go on and tell you a little bit about what that led to next, maybe.
Yeah, why not? I mean, we're going to struggle to get you here too often, so let's make the most of it.
Well, it turned out that this technique had never been used before for measuring fire smoke. And if you want to measure fire smoke before my PhD, you'd have to fly a plane through it, and suck all that smoke into an analyzer on board the plane. Or you'd suck it into a bag, and you'd have to have a laboratory fairly close by to analyze that smoke. And this technique, because it uses light, and you just shine the light through the smoke, you don't need to capture any of it. You can just measure it in situ. So this meant that we could measure wildfires in previously inaccessible places. It opened up a huge opportunity to fill in the gaps in our current knowledge, because at the time it was all based on aeroplane measurements, and there are plenty of places in the world where you can't get these fancy aeroplanes. And Northern Australia was one of them. We looked at fires burning in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory of Australia. And then back here in the UK, you need a lot of funding to have one of these aircraft. And most people thought that the fires burning in Northumberland and on the in the Highlands of Scotland were not particularly important, but no one had measured the smoke before, which was an important gap in knowledge. So I've done work all over the world with this technique because it allows you to measure things that measure in places where it were quite difficult to access. And eventually, my work took me to Southeast Asia. This is a particularly important place in the world for fire smoke because it affects so many people. The fires there burn in peatlands, and so I spent most of the last 10 years measuring smoke from fires on tropical peat swamp forests in Indonesia and Malaysia.
Well, the question I'd like to ask you is closer to home. Could you share some thoughts on the UK climate? It seems to be getting quite warm around here, and increasing temperatures and the frequency of UK wildfires.
Yes. So another strand to my research, which began with that work up in Northumberland, originally I was looking at the smoke, but I became very interested in how fires behave. So that's how fast they move and the intensity with which they burn, because that can also affect the smoke. But fundamentally, we need to understand a little bit more about how fires behave under different weather conditions. And so I've done quite a lot of work with Northumberland Fire Rescue Service, Dorset Fire and Rescue Service on monitoring training fires, for example, in these places and measuring the fires, how fast they move and how big the flames are, and trying to relate that to the weather. Um, and part of my work led me to be on the UK Climate Risks Independent Climate Change Risk Assessment for the UK. The last one came out in 2022. And, that was all about the UK's changing climate. And there was a chapter on wildfire risk, which I contributed to. It was quite ironic, or maybe coincidental, that it came out in 2022 because that was the year that you may remember London having 40 plus temperatures in the summer, record
Yeah.
breaking summers. And there were fires on the edge of London and also in Norfolk that burnt down people's homes. It was the first time that we had lost property in that way to wildfires. So, I mean, that for me is a stark sign that things are changing in terms of the way fires behave in the UK because that hadn't happened before. There's no institutional memory, no memory of firefighters having to fight fires that were right on the urban fringes, moving from rural areas or grassland areas or recreational parks into people's properties. And so the climate has changed in the UK. We can look at average temperatures, and recent decades are 1.5 degrees warmer than 100 years ago. But for me, as a wildfire scientist, it's not necessarily about those changing temperatures, the average temperatures. It's what's happening with the extremes. So we look at the length of a warm spell. These have shifted quite dramatically. In Dorset, the average length of a warm spell, a period of time where temperatures are above what they should usually be for that time of the year, has shifted from 1 to 5 days in Dorset to, in some places, 10 to 15 days. So these very long periods of abnormally warm weather. And as you can probably imagine, that's quite important for fires because that warm weather has the ability to dry out the vegetation on the ground and make more of it available to burn. The longer you have warm weather and lower humidity in the air, the more stuff, the more fuel, the more vegetation is dry enough to catch fire if a flame were to meet it. And so these longer warm spells are important, but obviously 2025, the year of the heat wave, we had three significant heat waves at the end of spring and into summer. And the frequency and the duration of heat waves is increasing. The frequency is rising, and the intensity of those heat waves, so the maximum temperatures and the number of days above 30 degrees, for example, is also changing. And as I say, all of this corresponds to a change in the amount of fuel that is available to burn on the ground. That's the fundamental thing when it comes to wildfire behavior. And so it's no surprise that rate of spread is increasing for many fires. Fires are moving faster than they did before. And we know this from our monitoring of a limited number of fires, but we all also know this from talking to firefighters on the ground. It's not just the rate of spread, it's how big the flames are as well, which directly affects how difficult it is to fight these fires. So the UK's climate is changing, particularly when it comes to the extremes and warm weather, which is important for wildfire behaviour. And it's if we look at the fire statistics alone, we look at the satellite record, which now goes back 20 years. The UK could go a few years without there being a single significant fire in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And what we've seen in the past 12 years is that there have been significant fires every year, but also, perhaps worryingly, what we're seeing is a trend to larger burnt area across the UK and a larger number of fires, absolute number of fires. And 2025 was the record year. It blew the previous year out of the water. So, yeah, climate is changing and it's for sure affecting this particular hazard on UK landscapes.
So the next question I'd like to ask you, and forgive me, we could probably be here for several days on this one. So I don't know how you can answer it possibly in a few minutes, but nonetheless, you'll have a stab at it. One of your research focal points is tropical forest deforestation and degradation. What most concerns you about this and the impacts that it will have?
Yeah, it's a totally different issue. Wildfire is such an interesting subject, and it's linked to the tropical forest deforestation, obviously, because usually if you remove a forest, fire is a very important technique for both the removal of the forest and then for the management of the land once you've removed the forest. But unlike here in the UK and other high latitude places, the reason why we're seeing a change in fire behavior is not a combination of climate change and changes in land management, because that's important here in the UK as well. I've talked a lot about climate change, but also the way we manage our land is important. But in the tropics, it's very much this deforestation issue because of the significant impact that has on the moisture close to the ground. You know, if we think about a tropical rainforest, a tropical lowland swamp forest, think about the Amazon, for example, it maintains its own climate. It can withstand a lengthy drought of months, if not a couple of years, because for a start, the forests generate their own rainfall, but also underneath the canopy, the moisture is always very high. It's one of the few ecosystems on the planet that is fire resistant. Okay, fire is not a part of this ecosystem. Everywhere else you look on the planet, you'd expect to see fire at some point playing a part, playing a role, but here it's not natural. And so you remove the trees, you remove the canopy cover, and importantly, in the peat swamps, they drain the land as well to make the peat soil suitable for planting oil palm trees, for example. And that combination of exposing the ground to sunlight and making it less resilient to drought, and the draining of the soil, which lowers the water table, which of course this is a swamp, it would normally be close to the surface, that exposes a huge amount of material that is flammable. We're talking about peat here, which, you know, for hundreds of years has been used as a fuel for warming homes. If we think about Ireland in particular, that peat is now available to burn, and it takes very little to ignite a peat fire. A discarded cigarette, a broken bottle. If it's been dry for days or weeks, then you have the potential there for a significant peat fire. And peat is you know, if anyone's seen a peat fire, it doesn't burn with a flame. It smolders. It's a very dirty form of combustion. A lot of that carbon contained in the fuel is not being efficiently converted into carbon dioxide, which in this case would be the best option. CO2 is the cleanest product from combustion. It may drive global warming, but all of the other possible products in combustion, like carbon monoxide and many kind of incomplete combustion products, can drive very poor air quality in the region. So these fires, when they start, because they smolder, they're very difficult to put out, and they burn for weeks, if not months in some cases, depending on when the next rains will fall, producing a very thick smoke or smoky haze that covers a huge region, home to tens of millions of people. So we have people exposed to hazardous air quality for months at a time, which we know is affecting life expectancy, infant mortality, and has a hugely detrimental effect on people with pre-existing conditions like asthma.
So, the last question for you today is in all these challenges, and especially on a global basis, what two things would you like change tomorrow that would set us on the road to recovery? If you could change two things, what would they be? You probably need to change 22, but let's try two.
Yeah, this is a huge question, and you did put this question to me in advance, thankfully, because I think
Mm.
I'd be. It's a very difficult one to pin down two things, and maybe one part of the answer is actually there are no two things. There's no silver. There are
Oh,
no silver. There's no silver bullet or two silver bullets for climate change. But if I was to pick my go-to, I'd go for one that's practical and one that's more philosophical. One is we have to embrace solar and wind technology. I think anybody who is turning their back on this and trying to resist it needs to have a rethink. Solar and wind, it's clean. There are so many co-benefits in terms of air pollution, which is a separate issue to climate change. The technology, we need to get on it now because in 10 years' time, it will be so cheap that everyone else will be doing it. We need to be leaders on this. So if I'm thinking from a UK perspective, this is the next industrial revolution. Like we want to lead the way with this, and solar and wind will provide the majority of Earth's energy needs in decades' time, I think. So we need to be ahead of the curve there and not playing catch up and resisting and clinging on to old technologies like the Luddites. So that's how I put it in a practical sense is picking solar and wind because there's just so much there. And I think the other one is more philosophical, and that is we need to understand the prisoner's dilemma that we are in. This, oh, well, we're not going to do this because they're not doing it. I think kind of relates to the solar and wind problem. I think the one thing for me is I have to question myself, question my motives when I travel somewhere, what I decide to choose for my diet, where I drive, when I drive, what I'm driving. All of these questions, there's a simple question we ask ourselves what would the world look like if everyone did this? It's the absolute classic question. And I think that helps us get out of the prisoner's dilemma is if we imagine a future where we all stick to our guns, and that future doesn't look particularly good right now. In fact, we're beginning to live it. So yeah, a little bit of common sense and thinking about others is important.
so Thomas Smith, thank you so much for this interview. It's truly been a great pleasure, and thank you.
Thanks, Harry.